Good morning, everyone. Mrs. Connolly here. Today, as you know, I'm at a funeral today, so I won't be in class. But today we have our minimum day special schedule, so you will be in class for 86 minutes. Today you should be watching the videos that are going to follow this, and then you should be reviewing for your 1984 test. Here's the rules for the test. We're going to take the test on Monday. You need to be here, and you can bring 1 page of notes with you, but handwritten only. And you can use front and back for your notes. So hopefully that'll help you prepare, and you'll have probably half the period to prepare for the test. Please remember, I don't want you running all over campus and, getting in trouble during class. So if you need to go to the bathroom, you only get 5 minutes, and I want you to turn your phone into the sub before you go. Also, please no talking. A lot of people, they need the room to be quiet so it's easy for them to study. Okay? Well, I hope you guys have a great weekend. I hope you enjoy yourselves this weekend. Make sure you study for your test because it will help a lot. And then I will see you when I get back. Okay, have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
My name's Ed Snowden. I'm 29 years old. I work for Booz Allen Hamilton as an infrastructure analyst for NSA in Hawaii.
What are some of the positions that you held previously within the intelligence community?
I've been a systems engineer, systems administrator, senior advisor for the Central Intelligence Agency, solutions consultant, and a telecommunications information systems officer.
One of the things people are going to be most interested in trying to understand who you are and what you're thinking is there came some point in time when you crossed this line of thinking about being a whistleblower to making the choice to actually become a whistleblower. Walk people through that decision-making process.
When you're in positions of privileged access, like a systems administrator for these sort of intelligence community agencies, you're exposed to a lot more information on a broader scale than the average employee. And because of that, you see things that may be disturbing, but over the course of a normal person's career, you'd only see 1 or 2 of these instances. When you see everything, you see them on a more frequent basis, and you recognize that some of these things are actually abuses. And when you talk to people about them, in a place like this where this is the normal state of business, people tend not to take them very seriously and move on from them. But over time, that awareness of wrongdoing sort of builds up, and you feel compelled to talk about it. And the more you talk about it, the more you're ignored, the more you're told it's not a problem, until eventually you realize that these things need to be determined by the public, not by somebody who is simply hired by the government.
Talk a little bit about how the American surveillance state actually functions. Does it target the actions of Americans?
NSA and the intelligence community in general is focused on getting intelligence wherever it can by any means possible that it believes, on the grounds of sort of a self-certification, that they serve the national interest. Originally, we saw that focus very narrowly tailored as foreign intelligence gathered overseas. Now, increasingly, we see that it's happening domestically. And to do that, the NSA specifically targets the communications of everyone. It ingests them by default. It collects them in its system, and it filters them, and it analyzes them, and it measures them, and it stores them for periods of time, simply because that's the easiest, most efficient, and most valuable way to achieve these ends. So while they may be intending to target someone associated with a foreign government or someone that they suspect of terrorism, they're collecting your communications to do so. Any analyst at any time can target anyone, any selector, anywhere. Where those communications will be picked up depends on the range of the sensor networks and the authorities that that analyst is empowered with. Not all analysts have the ability to target everything, but I, sitting at my desk, certainly had the authorities to wiretap anyone from you or your accountant to a federal judge to even the president if I had a personal email.
One of the extraordinary parts about this episode is that usually whistleblowers do what they do anonymously and take steps to remain anonymous for as long as they can, which they hope often is forever. You, on the other hand, have decided to do the opposite, which is to declare yourself openly as the person behind these disclosures. Why did you choose to do that?
I think that the public is owed an explanation of the motivations behind the people who make these disclosures that are outside of the democratic model. When you are subverting the power of government, that's a fundamentally dangerous thing to democracy. And if you do that in secret consistently, as the government does when it wants to benefit from a secret action that it took, it'll kind of give its officials a mandate to go, hey, tell the press about this thing and that thing, so the public is on our side. But they rarely, if ever, do that when an abuse occurs. That falls to individual citizens, but they're typically maligned. It becomes a thing of these people are against the country, they're against the government. But I'm not. I'm no different from anybody else. I don't have special skills. I'm just another guy who sits there day to day in the office, watches what's happening, and goes, this is something that's not our place to decide. The public needs to decide whether these programs and policies are right or wrong. And I'm willing to go on the record to defend the authenticity of them and say, I didn't change these. I didn't modify the story. This is the truth. This is what's happening. You should decide whether we need to be doing this.
Have you given thought to what it is that the U.S. government's response to your conduct is in terms of what they might say about you, how they might try to depict you, what they might try to do to you?
Yeah, I could be, rendered by the CIA. I could have people come after me, or any of their third-party partners. They work closely with a number of other nations, or they could pay off the triads, or any of their agents or assets. We've got a CIA station just up the road in the consulate here in Hong Kong, and I'm sure they're going to be very busy for the next week. And that's a fear I'll live under for the rest of my life, however long that happens to be. You can't come forward against the world's most powerful intelligence agencies and be completely free from risk, because they're such powerful adversaries that no one can meaningfully oppose them. If they want to get you, they'll get you in time. But at the same time, you have to make a determination about what it is that's important to you. And if living unfreely but comfortably is something you're willing to accept, and I think many of us are, it's the human nature. You can get up every day, you can go to work, you can collect your large paycheck for relatively little work against the public interest, and go to sleep at night after watching your shows. But if you realize that that's the world that you helped create, and it's going to get worse with the next generation and the next generation who extend the capabilities of this sort of architecture of oppression, you realize that you might be willing to accept any risk. And it doesn't matter what the outcome is, so long as the public gets to make their own decisions about how that's applied.
Why should people care about surveillance?
Because even if you're not doing anything wrong, you're being watched and recorded. And the storage capability of these systems increases every year consistently by orders of magnitude, to where it's getting to the point you don't have to have done anything wrong. You simply have to eventually fall under suspicion from somebody, even by a wrong call. And then they can use the system to go back in time and scrutinize every decision you've ever made, every friend you've ever discussed something with, and attack you on that basis to sort of derive suspicion from an innocent life and paint anyone in the context of a wrongdoer.
We are currently sitting in a room in Hong Kong, which is where we are because you traveled here. Talk a little bit about why it is that you came here, and specifically there are going to be people who will speculate that what you really intend to do is to defect to the country that many see as the #1 rival of the United States, which is China, and that what you're really doing is essentially seeking to aid an enemy of the United States with which you intend to seek asylum. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So there's a couple assertions in those arguments. that are sort of embedded in the questioning of the choice of Hong Kong. The first is that China is an enemy of the United States. It's not. I mean, there are conflicts between the United States government and the Chinese PRC government, but the peoples inherently, we don't care. We trade with each other freely. We're not at war. We're not in armed conflict, and we're not trying to be. We're the largest trading partners out there for each other. Additionally, Hong Kong has a strong tradition of free speech. People think, oh, China, great firewall. Mainland China does have significant restrictions on free speech, but the people of Hong Kong have a long tradition of protesting in the streets, of making their views known. The internet is not filtered here, no more so than any other Western government. And I believe that the Hong Kong government is actually independent in relation to a lot of other leading Western governments.
If your motive had been to harm the United States and help its enemies, or if your motive had been personal material gain, were there things that you could have done with these documents to advance those goals that you didn't end up doing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, anybody in the positions of access with the technical capabilities that I had could, suck out secrets, pass them on the open market to Russia. They always have an open door, as we do. I had access to, the full rosters of everyone working at the NSA, the entire intelligence community, and undercover assets all around the world, the locations of every station we have, what their missions are, and so forth. If I had just wanted to harm the U.S., that you could shut down the surveillance system in an afternoon. But that's not my intention. And I think for anyone making that argument, they need to think, if they were in my position, and you live a privileged life, you're living in Hawaii in paradise and making a ton of money, what would it take to make you leave everything behind? The greatest fear that I have regarding the outcome for America of these disclosures is that nothing will change. People will see in the media all of these disclosures. They'll know the lengths that the government is going to grant themselves powers unilaterally to create greater control over American society and global society. But they won't be willing to take the risks necessarily to stand up and fight to change things, to force their representatives to actually take a stand in their interests. And the months ahead, the years ahead, it's only going to get worse until eventually there will be a time where policies will change, because the only thing that restricts the activities of the surveillance state are policy. Even our agreements with other sovereign governments, we consider that to be a stipulation of policy rather than a stipulation of law. And because of that, a new leader will be elected. They'll flip the switch, say that because of the crisis, because of the dangers that we face in the world, some new and unpredicted threat, we need more authority, we need more power, and there will be nothing the people can do at that point to oppose it, and it'll be turnkey tyranny.
Edward Snowden, thanks for joining me on Upfront. We're also joined from San Francisco by Daniel Ellsberg. Edward Snowden, let me start with you. What quality, what characteristic do you think defines a whistleblower? What makes someone such as yourself or Daniel go public with state secrets, take such massive risks with your reputation, with your career, with your safety?
It's a very difficult and kind of complex question, because I typically don't classify people. I don't like the whistleblower terminology, the hero terminology, or traitor terminology. Anything where we're otherizing people, it creates distance between them. But if we want to think about the general behaviors that people share, the general choices that they make, I think it ultimately comes down to, you see a structure of laws where the legality of the times are becoming more and more divorced from the morality of our daily lives, the daily decision making, the sort of values we hold. And when we have that, you ultimately have to make a choice about what do you have a greater commitment to, the law or to justice. And that's what being a whistleblower is about to me.
Daniel, do you share that view? What was going through your mind back in 1971 when you took that decision to go up against the US government over Vietnam?
Well, I feel a great identity with Edward Snowden. I think a whistleblower tends to be an insider who has been aware for some time, often, and been silent about abuses or injustices, crimes, lies, like many of his colleagues have been aware. And there comes a time when he or she realizes it's wrong to continue to be silent, to hold these secrets away from the outsiders who are being harmed by the secrecy of that information.
Edward, a lot of people shrug their shoulders and say, so what if spy agencies spy on people? That's what they're paid to do. Or they say, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear.
When I hear that, I think, saying that you don't care about the right to privacy because you have nothing to hide is no different than saying you don't care about freedom of speech because you have nothing to say. It's a fundamentally un-American principle, and more than just nationalism, more than just what this country is about, it's a deeply anti-social principle, because rights are not just individual, they're collective. And what may not have value to you today may have value to an entire, population, an entire people, or an entire way of life tomorrow. And if you don't stand up for it, then who will?
In 2009, back when you were working for the CIA, I believe, you went on an internet chat forum and wrote that people who leak classified information to the press should be, quote, shot in the balls. How did you go from being that guy to being the guy responsible for the biggest leak of government secrets in US history?
Well, so first off, I have to say, as a privacy advocate, that I've never claimed authorship of that, and it would be sort of irresponsible for me to say people who have been digging into these old statements and trumpeting them to sort of criticize someone, that's something we should support. But for the sake of argument, let's say yes. Let's say I wrote that. If I did write that, it's important to think about the fact that it doesn't really matter what anybody thinks at a given point in their development, right? Because I came from a federal family. And when you're someone like me who sort of grows up in the system where you believe everything the government says is likely to be true, because why would they possibly lie to us? And you find more and more clear evidence that not only is the public being misled, but they're being misled on the basis of programs that are not effective, and in some ways are actively harmful. You have to think about how would that change your view? How would that change your personality? And what would you do?
But as for harmful, you've also argued in the past that they're illegal, they're unconstitutional. And yet last week, we saw a federal appeals court in Washington seem to suggest that what the NSA is doing in terms of collecting phone data, etc., may be legal, which, if that's the case, would be a blow to your cause, would it not?
There is no longer a question of whether the NSA's mass surveillance programs were legal or illegal. That's actually been resolved in the ACLU versus Clapper when it was ruled that these programs were unlawful. The issue that we're seeing in the courts, and this is an ongoing thing for the last 50 years, is that courts won't tell you whether or not a program is lawful or unlawful until you can prove that it actually exists. And when the government denies that these programs exist, the only way we can ever get a hearing on whether they're lawful or unlawful, constitutional or unconstitutional, is if we have whistleblowers come forward and reveal actual classified evidence, which allows the courts to say under their own rules, this is a real program, this is a real controversy that must be resolved.
There's a big debate about how you ended up living in Russia. Regardless of how you got there, you did choose of your own volition to say this about Russia once you arrived.
These nations, including Russia, have my gratitude and respect for being the first to stand against human rights violations. They have earned the respect of the world.
Surely you must now, listening to that, regret making that pretty odd statement, given Russia's own awful human rights record. Is it something you want to withdraw? Do you want to take that statement back?
Well, no, I think it's out of context. So it's important to actually look at it in a broader perspective. It was a list of nations.
Yes.
And the specific context of the statement was the first to stand up against the violations of the powerful.
Yes, you referred to Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Ecuador. But you did start the sentence with Russia, and you then said, earn the respect of the world. A lot of people see Russia's actions in Chechnya, Russia's actions abroad in terms of dealing with dissidents, journalists at home, and say, under no scenario is Russia a small nation, and under no scenario should it earn the respect of the world on human rights.
When I was speaking about this, I wasn't talking about the government specifically. I was talking about the nation as a people. And when you think about what's going on with these different populations, they're all struggling. And yes, when you look in Russia domestically, they have huge human rights difficulties, as with many other countries around the world. But what you also see in these countries is that there's a very strong movement to improve human rights. And while the government itself may work against that, the people obviously are trying to advance that. And I think that's something to improve. And I would point out that I've been extremely critical of Russia's human rights record, particularly as it relates to the internet, because we've seen a growing amount of censorship, a growing amount of critical, controlling, bad, and honestly, completely unnecessary laws.
Would you describe President Putin as an authoritarian leader, a dictator? How would you describe him?
I don't think anybody would question the assertion that he's an authoritarian leader. That's sort of his brand.
What happens in August 2017, almost exactly 2 years from now, when your temporary asylum period in Russia expires? Where do you go next? Is the US, is a US return a possibility? We had President Obama's former Attorney General, Eric Holder, recently saying that the possibility of a plea deal was still on the table, although other US officials have said that the chances of a deal are now, quote, close to non-existent.
Right, so all of the officials that say close to non-existent are speaking anonymously off the record. Eric Holder did make a significant sort of concession there, which is that people recognize that sort of a show trial, which is what's on the table right now, is not in the interests of the public. It's not in the interests of the government. It's not in anyone's interests, including my own. I have been consistent in saying that the only thing I want from the government in order to come back and stand trial is guarantees of a fair trial where I can, put forth a public interest defense.
Let me put that point to Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel, a lot of people say Edward Snowden should follow your example. Come back regardless of whatever terms are offered and face a court of law. What do you say to them?
I think Edward Snowden learned from my example and from that of many others like Tom Drake and really all of the whistleblowers who have been tried under President Obama. None of them has had a fair trial. I did not have a fair trial and could not have had under the Espionage Act, which did not permit me to even to tell the jury ever why I had copied the Pentagon Papers, what my motives were, what I thought the benefit would be, what the harm might have been and what it wasn't. None of that was allowed in under the strict liability of the Espionage Act, which is what Snowden would be tried under. The fact is, I did have a fair ending to my trial. Charges were dismissed because of governmental misconduct against me.
Just briefly, Edward, do you think you'll ever be able to come back?
There's no question that I am living in exile, and I continue to expect to live in exile for the foreseeable future. At the same time, the government's primary basis for criticizing me for taking a strong position against me is that they say it's caused some damage. But now we're in 2015, and the government has never at any point demonstrated any evidence of any harm that's occurred as a result of these disclosures. And in fact, with each passing year, we see more and more evidence that this has done a tremendous public good. The laws inside the United States and outside the United States are all changing as a result of this information, and we are actually living in a more safe and better world that has greater respect for human rights as a result of the fact that we, the people, are now a part of the decision-making about this topic in government.
I believe you also told the journalist who broke your story to spread out the documents you gave them because, quote, if the government thinks you're the single point of failure, they'll kill you. Do you really believe President Obama would have ordered the assassination of journalists as high profile, as well known as Glenn Greenwald, then of The Guardian, and Barton Gellman of The Washington Post? Surely you don't actually believe that.
Certainly not in a way that would not be deniable. But at the same time, we have to look at the history of these cases. The President of the United States has already authorized the extrajudicial killing of a United States citizen far from any battlefield. And when you have that precedent set, and you think about the fact that from the government's perspective, these programs were necessary. They were vital to the national security of the entire nation. And there was one individual somewhere who, by interfering with sort of their ordinary operations, by doing any kind of operation, whether it was stealing their working materials, their journalistic materials, or whether it was indeed interacting with them in a physical nature, which would basically, I'm not going as far as to saying they would be killed. I do think that's a little bit too far. But the bottom line is you have to prepare journalists who have never worked in intelligence, who aren't they don't have a history in the Central Intelligence Agency, how seriously to take the reporting process. And when you say, if you are the single point of failure, if you make some mistake and advertise yourself as the one individual who the government can act against to stop this story, they will do so. I think that's a fair point and an important one to be made.
How about Hillary Clinton, former US Secretary of State? She accused you last year of helping terrorists with your NSA leaks. Now she's being accused of mishandling classified data on her own private email servers. She's even being investigated by the FBI, the Justice Department. How would you describe Hillary Clinton? What would you say to her now?
Now, this is a problem because anyone who has the clearances that the Secretary of State has or the director of any top-level agency has knows how classified information should be handled. And if an ordinary worker at the State Department or the Central Intelligence Agency or anything like that were sending details about the security of embassies, which is alleged to be in her emails, meetings with private government officials, foreign government officials, and the statements that were made to them in confidence over unclassified email systems, they would not only lose their job and lose their clearance, they would very likely face prosecution for
Do you
it.
think she potentially endangered US national security by being so careless with her email, from what you know about email and hacking?
It's not my place to say that. What I can say is when the unclassified systems of the United States government, which has a full-time information security staff, regularly get hacked, the idea that someone keeping a private server in the renovated bathroom of a server farm in Colorado is more secure is completely ridiculous.
Last year when I interviewed Jimmy Wales, the founder of Wikipedia, he called you a hero. Daniel's called you a hero too. Actor Matt Damon says his new Bourne film is inspired by you. So you're even inspiring action films. Others think you're a traitor. John Kerry, Secretary of State, has called you a traitor and a coward. Donald Trump, who's leading the race for the Republican presidential nomination, he called you a total traitor and said this about you.
This guy's a bad guy. And, you know, there is still a thing called execution.
Execution. Are you worried about what a President Trump might do to you?
No, I'm not. You know, it's very difficult to respond in a serious way to any statement that's made by Donald Trump. But when you've got Donald Trump and John Kerry on one hand, and people like Jimmy Wales who are improving the world, on the other hand, I think it's obvious which side that most people would rather be on. However, it's not about who's right and who's wrong. The arguments about whether I'm a good guy and a bad guy are a complete a red herring.
Say someone contacts you via encrypted email or whatever it is, and they say to you, you know what, I'm seeing horrible things. I want to go forward. I want to do what you did. But I see what you went through. I see what you had to give up. Should I do it or not? What advice would you give them? Do it or not do it?
I think it would be inappropriate to give specific advice, but what I would say is this is what my work at the Freedom of the Press Foundation is about, where we try to create paradigms where people can not only reveal government wrongdoing about serious violations of people's rights on an individual and a massive population-based scale, but that they can also be safe in doing it. We have created new tools, new infrastructures, where people do not have to do and make the same choices that they have in the past, where they realize if they stood up and said something, if they said the government is breaking the law, that they would suffer for it. They can, in the future, maintain their anonymity at the same time that they provide a vital public service and telling us the truth of what's really going on within the government.
Daniel, do you think he's best off where he is, or do you want to see him back in America? Do you think he's actually better off staying where he is?
I don't think he can ever come back to America. I don't think, unless the law changes very significantly, I think the intelligence services will never forgive him for embarrassing them and curtailing their illegal activities. And I think their influence on future presidents is likely to be enough that I don't foresee his being able to come back.
Edward, you're a modest man, and I understand you don't like it being all about you, but people are fascinated by you. I'm fascinated by you. I read an interview where you said you'd seen House of Cards, and I'm thinking, does this guy have a subscription to Netflix? How does he go shopping? Does he use a credit card? Because you're trying to stay off the grid. You're worried about US intelligence following you. How do you live? How do you shop every day? Do you get to go out? Are you going to be able to go out and watch the next Bourne film with Matt Damon inspired by you? Going to go to the cinema?
Sure. You know, I've met with a number of activists, a number of political figures around the world. I even met with Daniel Ellsberg out here locally. I live a normal life. I ride the subway like anybody else. The idea that people have that, you know, I have to live under a rock is a fundamental misunderstanding, I think, of how the nature of exile has changed. The government may be able to prevent me from physically returning home to the United States, engaging with people in person, but the ultimate result of that, because of advances in technology, means I can't shop at Walmart, but I can still lecture at Princeton.
And you can chat to me here in Washington, D.C. Edward Snowden, Daniel Ellsberg, thanks so much to both of you for joining me on our very first Upfront.